So this is going to be a shorter video than the last one that I did for last week. This UE 5.4 World Building intro was a pretty long video, but it had some of the foundational things that you need to know to be able to work in Unreal Engine and start creating environments. What I want to do here is I want to go over how I took that scene and finished it out to look like this, where I feel like, this is at the point where I can bring in some animation for the character and actually start really putting the scene together if I wanted to use this one. So some of the things that I definitely want to point out to you is underneath is the post-processing volume. I mentioned that it's just going to be this box that you have in your scene. You can see it's just in kind of the center of my scene right there. I can move it up a little bit so you could see it a little better. It's just a box. But it's a volume. So the reason it's a box is because you could do post-processing volume just on something that's inside of that box. But I'm not doing that because on the post-processing volume, I've gone in with it selected, which I have it selected right now in my scene items. And down here in the details, if I type in INF, I get infinite extent unbound, and you can see that's checked. And when you turn that check on, that's when that box doesn't matter anymore. It actually extends that box all the way around the entire scene. So now it's ignoring that box and it's applying whatever I do in this post-processing volumes attributes to the entire scene. So if I go down here, I can see that I'm using exposure. I've got that turned on, metering mode, and I've set it to manual. And I've set exposure compensation. Mine's at 9.16. So I can just slide that back and forth, and you can see that that's going to go from completely black to completely bright. And that's how I'm adjusting the lighting for my entire scene to make it look like an evening scene and to counteract some of the lights that might blow it out and make it look too bright. There are all kinds of other things in here I'm not using. There's bloom, which is going to give you sort of a brightness around lights or light areas, as if your camera is looking into a light and it's kind of creating a little bit of a bloom effect. There's dirt masks. There's all kinds of things for the camera, other exposure things, image effects, saturation, contrast, all of that stuff to overall affect the image that would be rendered here, which is what I'm looking at here on the left-hand side when I'm looking over here. Like I'm working in this right-hand side here. That's just a standard default viewport, perspective viewport. And on the left-hand side, I'm using main cam and cinematic viewport, which means that I'm seeing it the way it would look rendered. It may not be quite exactly what the rendered look is. There may be a few things that are extra when it renders, but it's close to it. That doesn't mean you won't see manipulators and stuff. over there if you're selecting things. If I select the character, or if I select a rock or something, you're going to see it selected in that viewport unless you hit the G key. Actually, you'll see it selected, but you won't see the, let me just activate this. So now you can see the fire is selected, but I'm not seeing any manipulators or anything in that view. Because I hit the G key. It turns off gizmos. So if I hit G again, all the gizmos come back. So that's a useful thing to have. The other thing I do is if I'm looking at it in this small little view, I really want to see what this looks like. I hit the G key again, turn it all off, and then I go up here to the pancake and go into immersive mode. And that way I can see it full screen or close to full screen with all the correct lighting and visual effects and everything. And you need to do that every once in a while, especially as you're going into your final look. You want to see it in full screen. You also want to see if the character is in focus. This is a very important thing with the camera. So if I now when I sorry, I should have brought my drink. When I hit the G key and I turn everything off, the only problem with that is that you may forget that you hit the G key, especially people who are new to Unreal Engine, and you'll be selecting things and you'll be like, it's not working. It's like broken. It's because you turned everything off with the G key. And you have to turn it all back on again in order to see it. And it's happened to me. Everybody who starts out in Unreal Engine, you'll do that and forget that you turned everything off. So if I turn everything off, usually I do it temporarily and then I turn it all back on again, so I don't accidentally forget. Okay, so other things that I've done here that are important is the focus on the character's face. So once you start dealing with a sequencer and trying to get a render out, you're going to want to make sure that your character is in focus. The way you do that select your camera. So I've named mine main cam. And under your camera settings, there is a focus area. So just go down until you find focus settings and open it up. And under focus settings, you're going to want to choose, initially, this is the easiest way to focus it on your character's face, is just choose tracking instead of manual. So the default is manual. And you'll probably notice that your character's face is blurry. You put it on tracking. And once it's on tracking, you go down and open tracking focus settings, and you choose under actor to track your character, the one that starts with BP. So your character, all the characters, all the metahumans will say BP underscore the name of your metahuman. You choose that to be your tracking target. And once you do that, that's the actor to track. Your character's face will usually be in focus at that point. There are some times when you're zooming in really close or something when the tracking doesn't work anymore. You actually have to switch back to manual and measure the distance between the camera and your character's face. And then you put the actual number in there. But, and you can animate that too. As the camera moves, you can change it, but you don't have to worry about that at all if you use this. Because when it's using tracking and your character's input, then if the camera moves, it's still going to be adjusting the camera focus for what it's tracking. So that's going to be the easiest thing to use. So the other things that I did in here to make this look better and more interesting, I put some visual effects in. So you can see a couple of P steam. It's P for particle. I'm going to zoom up above here so I can kind of look down. And you can see back there behind my rocks, there are a couple of particle steam particles, particle volumes. And so these are a bunch of particles coming out of an emitter back there. And I'm going to put a new one in. I'm going to put one in right sort of in between here. So what I did to do that is in the content browser, I have a starter content folder. That folder got imported when I turned on starter content when I created my scene. If you didn't do that, you won't have that folder there. You can still add it though. This is the starter content for Unreal Engine. It does make your file a little bigger, but there are some useful things in it. So I turned it on in the video. If you don't have it on, you can go to add here. Go to the top where it says add feature or content pack. And go to where it says content and click on starter content and add to project. Okay, that will add that starter content folder into your Unreal Engine project and it'll be here. And then you can open it up and you can find particles. And under particles, you have fire, P_fire, you have smoke, you have sparks, and you have steam. I like the steam one if I'm doing sort of a night scene that's kind of gonna have some fog or steam, volumetric. So this is different than the fog that's built into Unreal Engine. That's based on distance. It doesn't really move the same. It doesn't, you can't, it doesn't have the realism that this has when you place it into your scene in between layers of objects. So that's what I'm doing. I'm putting it in between my background and my different rocks and things that I put in here. So I put in a lot of rocks here. They might not be noticeable, that noticeable because I've made them look a lot like the ground plane, but they're giving a bumpiness to my ground that I didn't have to sculpt. You know, I pulled those in as mega scans. They're moss covered rocks and scaled them and placed them and duplicated them to create a waviness. You can see they have like a little waviness to them that's similar to the waviness in my background image. So it really, that's one of the reasons my foreground is really fitting with my background. It's not, I sculpted a little bit as you saw in the video, but I really added these to it as well, which have a higher resolution because they're actually photogrammetry captured and they have that high resolution that's more than just sculpting. And so I've got all of those things in here, and I'm placing these steam particle prefabs in between those rocks and stuff. So I'll pull another one out and I'll just place it right around here. Let's put it like behind this big rock, kind of in between those other two. And I'm gonna go in and scale it up by typing in scale. Let's make it even bigger than the other ones. Let's make it like 4 by 4 by 4. Okay, so now you can see that I've got this steam coming out there. I can move it around, I can move it up or rotate it. There is usually a direction, like you see that green arrow. That's the direction, the main direction of the steam emitter. So it was pointed this way. They're coming out in all different directions, and gravity is they're gonna go against gravity and stuff. But you can go and rotate this around. It's gonna come out in a slightly different way. I do want it to go in that direction towards the right, but maybe not all the way down like that. Maybe more up and down, up and to the right. And you can't really see it that much, but if I turn off the fire, you'll see it back there a little bit better. So I just turned off the eyeball symbol for the fire to it's not gone or anything. It would actually still render. And I'll go back to this steam, and I'm gonna switch to move. I guess I renamed it accidentally. And I kind of wanted to just show up behind this rock a little bit. And maybe it needs to be even bigger if I really wanted to show up. So what that does is that gives me some movement back there. That's subtle, right? It's not in your face, but I can see it, and it's creating another sort of, it's creating a visual effect on a layer behind the front layer, which creates more three-dimensional depth, right? Because it's not all over, it's on that particular layer. And then there's another layer behind it that you can see that in some cases it's in front of, but in some cases it's not. And you could light that differently too. Right now there's only the main scene lighting hitting that. Okay, so you can pull any of those things in, including the fire, which I placed right in front of the character. You can kind of see it right there. And I rotated it so the green arrow was facing upwards so that it looks like a fire's in front of the character. Some of the other things that I want to point out are the lights that I put in here. Again, I have 3 directional lights. Directional 2, 3, and the original one. If I look at these, as I mentioned, the first one is coming from the back. When you put multiple directional lights in your scene, you will get an error message. And what you have to do is there is a parameter that is called forward shading priority that needs to be different for each of those directional lights. So if you look at my directional lights, the one behind the main one is got 0. The 2 one has 1, and the 3 one has 2 on it, to give those different priorities, and then the error will go away. It's because the main one, the top level one, it's calculating some of the main shadows and other sort of baked properties of the render, and it needs to know what those are. If you are going to put multiple directional lights in there, like I'm doing, you probably want to turn the shadows off. Like, I do not have cast shadows on my directional lights 2 and 3, because they're really supposed to be like, I'm trying to simulate the lighting effects in the background where it's filling in the shadows and some blue light, and it's casting red light from something over here, which actually in my sky dome is a sort of a red northern lights effect, which you can't even see in this particular. You can kind of see a little bit of it there, but there's a bunch of it over here, and that's what's causing all these boulders to be red on one side. So I don't want to cast a shadow from that, because that would make shadows all over the place, like going in all different directions. And that would just look weird. That's not what happens with bounce light. It's not what happens with ambient light from something like the Northern Lights. So if I'm doing ambient light, or if I'm doing something from the atmosphere and not like a sun, then I'm going to turn shadows off. That way I don't have confusing shadows. And so that helped a lot on my lighting. That sort of fixed a lot of the lighting problems when I put those in there. As I mentioned, I do have one spotlight kind of going from where the fire is up towards the character. I'll just frame that. And you can kind of see that right there. And when you're setting these things like a spotlight, you know, that one I put a really warm color on because it's supposed to be from the fire, and I will actually add a light function to it later on, which is something in the blueprint that will make it flicker like a firelight. But it's just a static light at this point. But I did make it movable because I do want it to allow for dynamic shadows. So if you want a light, and it's not a directional light, if you think you might move the light at all, then you want to make it movable. And then I just adjust my intensity settings. And I a lot of these lights I have put use temperature on, because that allows me to make it an even warmer light. You just adjust the slider there, and it'll go cooler or it'll go warmer based on which way you do the slider for temperature. This one I am casting shadows with because I do want shadows to be cast from that fire onto the rocks behind the character. And that's going to be a really important part of the scene. So I'm going to have to work on that some more. But this is just giving me a basic effect there. And then the rest of it is really just placement and moving stuff around, and then the camera. So going back to the main cam here, when I set my camera, I set some of the main parts, or I really just set, like, I made it a wide angle lens, and I put the tracking on it. But the other thing, the current focal length is actually currently 12, and that's what's making it a wide angle lens. If you leave it, the problem with leaving it at like 35, which is kind of the default, is you will not see hardly any of your background. And that's a big problem because we're trying to make an environment that you want to show off. And if you use something like 35 millimeters, you're going to have to really zoom out to be able to see a lot of your background. So I prefer to put it down to 12 or something like that. I probably don't usually go lower than 12. At some point, you will get some distortion maybe around the edges, like you get towards a fisheye lens, but it's really not too bad at 12. And so I think you can do that, and you can see a lot of your background. You don't have to move your camera real far away, which then causes other problems because things can get in the way of it and stuff like that. So I usually use that setting. And then when I bring my camera into my sequence, as I did in the video, when you want to render something out, let's say I want to render this scene out, you're going to use this little clapboard symbol here. You're going to click on it to open up your render settings. And then what I want you to do is I want you to render out as a JPEG image. So when we get to where we're rendering, actually, if we render a cinematic and an animation, so I want to do a camera move or something, we could do that and render that out as an animation. I would not use the video sequence AVI. It will work, but the problem with that is that the quality is not that great. And if it crashes the machine, which frequently it does when you're doing a render, you'll lose the entire thing. Like you'll just lose it. So oftentimes I've had animations where the only way I can get the animation rendered is to actually do it as JPEGs and import them into Premiere and make them into a movie and add the sound there. So to get you used to start working with that, I want you to use image sequence JPEG, and you're gonna go to the bottom here where it says animation, open it up, and it also has advanced, and you can open that up too. And when you open up those, you're going to have a custom start frame and a custom end frame. They'll be grayed out. Go ahead and turn them on. And I'm rendering here from 0 to 0, 0, 10. So I'm rendering 10 frames. Because all I really want is one frame, right? I just want to see what the rendered frame looks like. So I don't need to render 100 frames to get that one frame. And I don't want to render just one frame because when you're using visual effects like I am, it takes a certain amount of frames for them to warm up. So, like, if I render one frame, the fire won't be there. If I render even 5 frames, the fire may not be there. If I render 10 frames, by 10, the fire is probably there. So normally we're rendering like 30 frames per second. So that 10 frames is 1/3 of a second. It's a really short amount. But it gives you enough time to get a warm up on all your visual effects and all your lighting, so that by the time you get to 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there, you're going to get a full, good render. I usually put up also a warm-up frame count of 4. Okay, so that's gonna, it'll cause it to warm up a little faster. And then you hit capture movie. You got to tell it where to go, where to save it. So up here under output directory, make sure you click on the 3 dots, find a place. I've got a renders folder that I made in my course folder on my desktop. And so that's where I'm rendering to. I'll make sure I select that folder. It's going to have a file format where it does the sort of the name dot frame. If we go look at the ones that I did, it's going to say the name of your scene, in this case, Macbeth scene start dot 0001 0000 0001, etc. You want that when you're doing an animation, because when you bring it into Premiere or some other editor, the way it brings it in as a sequence is to have those numbers there. And you usually want at least 4 steps in your number count, because that's going to get you up to thousands of frames, right? That'll get you up to 1,000 frames, or I'm sorry, 9,999 frames. At the next point, if you have a 10,000 frame or 12,000 or 15,000 frame animation, you're going to need to have 5 steps. Okay, so the number of steps on the end of the name like this is important. And it's set in here how many 0 pad frame numbers you're using. We're using 4 right now. If you know you have 10,000 frames or more, use 5. So now if I hit capture movie, I've already got some frames in here. Let's just delete these ones. I don't really need them. And these ones have a different name, so they're not going to get overwritten, or it's not going to step the name or anything. I'll go ahead and hit capture movie. It's going to flash up for a second, and then it's going to disappear. And when it flashed up, you saw that there was no character there and no flames and nothing there for a second. That was the warm-up, right? That was my 4-frame warm-up. And then if I go look at the render, at the beginning at frame 0, the character's there, but there's no flames. All right, and that's mainly there's no front flames. But if I look at, say, frame 5, still no flames. Okay, I'm starting to get flames at frame 10. So actually, maybe I need to, and see, every render is a different simulation. So last time I rendered, I had flames by frame 10, but this time I didn't. If I delete that, it only takes a second and render it again. Let's see if I get flames this time. Okay, by frame 10, I've got flames. But obviously the flames are only just warming up. I don't even really have any smoke from that fire, so I might want to go a little further. Yeah.
Why is it rendering as photos instead of, oh, you said it rendered a JPEG, not.
Rendering JPEG.
Yeah.
Individual frames, and I'm gonna check and see, does it look like my focus is clear? The face looks good. It looks clear. So I know my focus is fine, and I think it's looking good. If I decided, okay, let's try 30 frames and see what that looks like. Maybe I'll have an even better looking fire. Let's see. I'm just going to delete these ones so that it doesn't change the name. And then one thing, my resolution that I'm using here is 1920 by 1080. That is the resolution you should use. Okay, it's HD quality. It's what we would want for an animation. You could do 4K or something like that, but we don't need to. That's a good enough size. But I don't want you to do less than that. And I think the default is less than that. So make sure you set this resolution to 1920 by 1080. And I'm going to do 30 frames and try capturing it again. There I saw the fire for longer. You see it's going super fast. Renders do not take long. And if I go and look at frame 29, I'll see that I've got more fire. I've got some sparks. I've got some smoke. So it's definitely, the fire is fully going by that. So if I did want to do an animation, I'll just say one more thing. If I did want to do an animation with this camera, I could do that. I have set a keyframe on this camera just in case I accidentally move the camera, it'll pop back to where it's supposed to be. You can see it right there. It's on the transforms of the camera. The way you do that is, let's say I wanted to do a little camera move as an animation. I've got 165 frames. And if I look up here at the top of my window in my sequencer, I'm using 30 frames per second. So, and that's a good setting for a cinematic, right? You could do 24, that's film quality. You could do 60, that's generally for games and stuff that are really fast moving. But 30's standard. And you do want to make a note of that, because when you bring your animation or your frames into Premiere, you've got to make sure that you play them at 30 frames per second. It may default to that or it may not, because when you get a bunch of frames as JPEGs, they don't have any FPS on them anymore. The Premiere's not going to know that that's supposed to be played at 30 frames per second unless you tell it to. So, let's say I want to do a little camera move just to see what my environment looks like and my character and make it a little bit more interesting. So to do that, what I can do, first of all, I'm gonna move, zoom out a little bit to where I can see the camera. Maybe I'll zoom up a little bit too, just to make it easier. And I'm going to select the camera, and I want to let's say I want to go a little further out by the end of this animation, and I also want to decide how long this animation should be. At 30 frames per second, 5 seconds is going to be 150 frames. So right here, I have by default 165 frames. Let's say I want to do a 10-second animation. That would be 30 times 10 or 300. So I'm going to type in 300. Now you see that I just extended my timeline in my sequencer to 300. And the red line is the end of my animation. Like that's the end of my sequence. If I go over and type in here 300, which takes me over to the end of my animation with my timeline control, there's a little red line down here on the controls. There's a green one, there's a red one. These are for setting the beginning and end points of the sequence. If I go to 300 and I click that little red line, the other little red line will pop over to there. And now my beginning of my sequence is at 0. The end of my sequence is at 300. And my camera cuts needs to go all the way across that. So I'm going to drag it out until it gets to 300 as well. All I have right now is my main cam in here, and I did that by just dragging it down into my sequencer. It automatically made the camera cuts, and it did it according to the length of my sequence. Now I just resize my sequence. Then what I want to do is I want to create a little move. And how I think I want to do this is I'd like to see a little bit more of my environment. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit further at 300. And I'm going to find an endpoint, you know, somewhere where I want this to end. So maybe I'll just use my Alt and I'll dolly out with my left and middle mouse button and just go out a little bit further, just so I can see a little bit more of the environment. I just like to see the full thing. And maybe I'll tilt up a little bit so I can see a little bit more sky. Really kind of like a nice long shot. And I'll go ahead and go into my camera settings on the left of my sequencer, and down a ways, you might need to open up your camera component. Or actually, it's not part of the components. It's in main cam, which will probably already be open. But you have camera components, which are things like focus and current aperture and focal length. And then you have transforms. And that's what I'm using. I'm keyframing the transforms. So here's where I add another key. My timeline is on 300. I can see that here and here. So I'm going to hit the key. And I just created a key on 300. Now, if I move this, you'll see the camera move. All right. So probably I'd really like this key that's here to be more in the middle. So somewhere maybe down here. Because that's kind of a good place for sort of the middle, to check the middle of this. But now if I go back to 0, I'll type in 0, place my timeline on 0, then I can like maybe zoom into my character and see what it looks up close. So again, I'm gonna use my Alt key. I'm gonna use my middle mouse button, my right mouse button to drag in. Wheel is probably not gonna work too good for this. And maybe I want to sort of, I don't know, what should I do? How about, so this is, you notice it goes blurry after I get past the character. That's because of that tracking that I have set to the character. So it probably wouldn't be good for me to do a move past the character unless I want to change that and put on manual focus. So what I'm going to do, I think, is just kind of zoom in to around here. And I want to kind of grab the camera itself and rotate it a little bit. So I'm going to switch to rotation, and I'm going to just rotate so the character is kind of more in the frame. And that's what I was saying is with this tracking that I'm using, if you get too close to the character, sometimes it stops working. It just gets blurry. So to avoid that, I'll just go ahead and not get too close to it. So now I'll go ahead and set another key. And let's see what that move looks like. Because I really don't know what it's going to look like. Yeah, it looks fine. It looks fine. Kind of just going right above the fire. And we could go more through the fire if we wanted to. You can step to keys down here, to next, and then this one's jump to next key. So if I wanted to change this keyframe right here that I moved to the middle, a little bit further than the middle, I could use this step to next key to make me go directly onto that key. Because you don't want two keys right next to each other that are different because it'll look like a glitch. That's how you kind of do a cut. If you want to do a cut, you're going to put two keyframes right next to each other in different places. But we don't want to do a cut. We just want to do a continuous move here. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe I want this one to go a little bit further into the fire. So I'm just going to go down a little bit more. Like that. Now, the fire is coming from nowhere. I should go into Megascans and find a campfire and stick it down there so it looks actually like it's coming from something. Go ahead and key that. So now I reset that key so it sort of goes down into the fire and then continues out and up into a really long shot. And that shows me a lot about the environment, and it shows me the parallax that's happening on the camera. Parallax means things in the foreground are going to move more than the background when you're zooming out like this. And I'll just go to the beginning to front. And let's go ahead and render that whole thing. I'm going to save it first. And then I'm going to go into my render settings. And I'm going to set up how many frames I have, which is 300. So now instead of my end frame being 30, I'll make it 0300. So 0 to 300. It's going to go to the same place. Compression quality 100 means that I've got the best quality. It should default to 30 frames per second, but if you want to, you could just turn this on and make sure that it's doing 30 frames per second by setting it. I'm using 1920 by 1080, and then all the frames are going to show up here. We'll just delete these ones. I don't need these old ones either, so I'll go ahead and delete those too. So I got nothing in my folder, and then we'll go back and we'll capture movie. And you'll see it as it's happening. You'll see the whole thing. Super fast. And we can look in our folder. We can see that we have a bunch of frames here. We could open any one of those to see what it looks like. But I can't really see what the animation looks like unless I bring it into Premiere and I render it as an animation. So to do that, it's not hard. We should have Premiere on all our machines. All you're going to do is open Premiere up. I'm using on this machine the latest Premiere Pro. And so when this gets opened up, you want to create a new project. I'm going to create it a location. Let's put it into, I'm going to choose a location. Going to go into my folder that I've been working in on my desktop. There it is. And I've been working in renders. Oftentimes I like to put my Premiere project where my renders are. So I'm going to just go ahead and do that. So inside of renders, I'm going to create this Premiere project. It's going to be sequence 1. Let's go ahead and create it. I'm not choosing any kind of template or anything. We can give it a name in the upper left here. Let's call this process renders. And create. So once it gets up there to where you can see what's going on, I'm going to go ahead and do a file import. So I'm going to the file menu and importing, and find my renders folder. And find the first frame. So in my case, it's going to be frame, well, everybody's probably is going to be frame 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And then the most important thing, you got to check this little image sequence button down here. That's how it's going to find frame 0 and then 1, 2, 3. It'll just keep looking as long as you have a continuous frame numbers, it's going to find all of them. If you skipped a frame or if it glitched, then it might not find all of them. But let's go ahead and open them. I don't think we had any glitches. If you hover over it, you should see there's some kind of animation there. I'm going to drag that into my scene. And then, really important, you want to go to sequence and check your sequence settings, because you want to make sure that it's using 30 frames per second. It's actually using 29.97. That's close enough. Usually video is slightly off of 30. And so if you're rendering at 30 frames per second and you're going to bring it to video, you're probably going to be using 29.97. 1920 by 1080 is my size. All that looks correct. I'll say okay. If I look at it, I can see what the animation looks like. But if I really want to see what it looks like, I need to render it. So you render it. I could also add audio and everything here too. I'm going to render it though so I can see what the animation looks like by going to File, Export Media. Choose where it's going to go to. I'm going to put it to the same place as I've been using, into that renders folder. I'm going to name it Render Test 1. And I'm using match source, adaptive high bitrate, H.264 format. That's what you want to use. That's the best format to use, standard video format. It's going to put out an MP4. The reason you want to use match source is because then everything down here for your output should be the same as your input. So 1920 by 1080, 29.97, progressive. There's no audio. It's going to be a 24 megabyte file. I'll go ahead and export it. Should happen really fast. It's done. We'll go back out. We'll look through here. We should find my Premiere Pro project file as well as my video. When I double click it, I'm going to see the animation. I'm going to put it on loop. So we can just check it. Looks pretty nice. It's especially nice when that fire comes in and you see all of that heat waves coming through. It's a nice effect. I can see the parallax with my rocks and my background. And you can imagine that there'd probably be some kind of a soundtrack and ambient sound. And when that fire comes in, there'd be a right? And of course, at some point, we're going to have animation too. So other than the animation on the character, we have everything here. We have everything but sound and character animation. But the environment and camera, cinematography, lighting, all of that is here. It's working as a scene. I could continue working on it, of course, but it's all there. And it works as an environment. What do you guys think? Okay. It has a mood. It has an aesthetic. Now you can imagine that if we put custom clothes and a mask on this character and some other things, that we could probably have a very witchy looking scene, Halloweeny feeling scene. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the Zoom so that we can just spend the rest of the day working on stuff.